Thank you so much for joining us for the Q&A for Shorts Program 6. Let me introduce our guests again to you. We've got Smriti, Director of Shelter, joining us all from Los Angeles. Welcome, Smriti. We've got Matt, Director of Audible, joining us from Los Angeles. Welcome, Matt. And we've got Ryan, Director of Coded, also joining us from Los Angeles. So it's our LA crew today. So one of the questions I want to ask you is, all of your films introduce us to worlds that we're not likely to encounter before. And I'm curious, why do you feel like these stories are less likely to get attention? And why did you decide to tell these stories? So we'll start with you, Matt.
For Audible, it was, I'm always curious and attracted to things I don't know. I don't want to do a film about myself. And so I want to explore things I don't know and get curious and create a conversation around that. This one happens to be personal. My film's mostly told in sign language. It's, about deaf characters. And it's personal because my best friend since I was a kid is deaf. And I grew up about 30 miles from this school and have some other connections to the school. And so there's a personal thing, but I think I'm always attracted to other worlds that I kind of want to get deeper and maybe explore. There's always these topics, and I'm always trying to find the individual human stories within those topics and themes, and maybe show that that world's maybe not so different.
Yeah, thank you. Ryan?
My film's about an artist named J.C. Lyondecker, who I had never heard of when I began this film, somewhat shamefully. I had made a doc series last year for Apple called Visible that's about the history of LGBTQ representation on television. And so that series began at the beginning of television. And our first story in that series was the Army McCarthy hearings, because it was the first time the word gay was ever said on television. The first time people were talking about homosexuals in a very derogatory way, mind you. But in the research for that series, I grew up in Georgia in the 80s. We definitely did not learn gay history in school. I don't know if kids are learning it today, but I definitely wasn't. So it was in researching that series that I learned about this era that predated World War II and the Depression. That was an era of incredible progress for LGBTQ people in the 1920s in cities around the world. And I embarrassingly didn't know anything about that era until I was doing research for that series. And so when we discovered, Imagine came to me to make this doc, and they kind of gave me the mandate to do whatever I wanted about the world of advertising and LGBTQ representation. And we found this artist. And so I love sort of that genre of documentaries of forgotten heroes or unsung heroes. And I felt like this man who I had never heard of deserved to have that story told. So that's how it began.
Yeah, it was really shocked by how many of the images I was familiar with, and I didn't know who this person was at all. So really glad that you introduced us to him. Smriti.
Yes. So my film is, about the housing crisis, and particularly really focused around Los Angeles and Southern California. LA has the highest chronic unhoused population in the United States. And it's almost a bipartisan sort of issue, in the sense that people who consider themselves both progressive and conservative don't want low-income housing built in their communities. They don't want homeless people in their communities. There is such a stigma around being unhoused, and yet it is so pervasive and getting worse and worse, every day. It's a deliberately bureaucratic issue, and it's deliberately designed to make it almost impossible to solve. And I wanted to dive into the issue, but not, through the lens of an issue. I wanted to really, take an audience on a journey to really experience what that means in unexpected ways. I think we have an idea about homelessness, that involves tent cities and, drug addiction and things like that. But there are, lots of people, lots of families, children around the country that experience homelessness. And the majority of people in this country are, you know, 1 or 2 paychecks away from experiencing it themselves. So I wanted to bring an audience on a journey that would help them see what it's like, and the full implications of being unhoused through the eyes of young people and children. And I think part of that is seeing that the effects of homelessness are not just, you know, not knowing where you're going to sleep tonight, or having to sleep in your car or in a tent or in a motel room once in a while, but also the soft costs, you know, for the children, you know, in my film, you know, a lot of them like couldn't, you know, because of the pandemic, like couldn't engage with school the way that they needed to, because they couldn't have regular access to Wi-Fi, or you know, or couldn't physically be in any place for a long enough time to enroll in school. And then that creates, especially at sort of that 8 to 10 age, will set a child back, you know, considerably. If you sort of fall off the sort of school trajectory at that point, you know, it sort of, you know, kind of messes up the trajectory of the rest of your life. And that's how, you know, generational cycles continue. So I wanted to show that, and then also show sort of a radical alternative, which is through one of the storylines, you know, in the film. It's about a young woman, you know, and her 2 children who occupied a house and decided to take matters into their own hands, cut through the bureaucracy, cut through, you know, the sort of cycles, and sort of force a conversation around this, which I thought was unbelievably brave and really effective. And I think what they did was they allowed us to see that homelessness is part of this sort of toxic, you know, capitalist sort of structure that I think we're recognizing from various angles is not serving society the way that, or it's not serving the vast majority of society the way that we once thought it did, or we all grew up accepting that it would. And I wanted to sort of show an alternative to that, you know, maybe a bit far-fetched, may not be an option for everybody, but I wanted to show a family that was sort of breaking out of that cycle, and perhaps trying to carve a path for the rest of us.
Yeah, it's very powerful to see their journeys. And one thing you brought up that I'm curious for all of you guys. So I'm curious, did the pandemic itself change your projects at all? And like, how were you able to create the films that you set out to? What changed, if anything, or were you able to kind of not really have that be an issue? We'll start with Matt again.
It didn't affect the story or production. We shot it and had it in the can before everything was shut down, but it affected most of post, in that we had to quickly mobilize and figure out, you know, we were probably a month into the edit, I think. And, you know, we hadn't all, the community, our industry, figured out how to edit remotely quickly. So, but we quickly mobilized, and then post was done. I came down here every day and logged in and edited live with my editor who lives somewhere else. And yeah, pretty much did most of post remotely. I think I went into a color session once, but in a different room. So very challenging, but you know, grateful and fortunate that I got to continue making the film. So I have no complaints.
Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, this film, I'm sure all of the filmmakers on here have done this in the past year, where you're kind of somewhat strategically choosing how to tell a story because of the constraints of COVID. This one was very convenient in the sense, normally I don't do historical films or retrospective films. I don't think I've ever made a film about a dead person, but this one, because it was someone who lived through the 20s and 30s, and I couldn't be doing verite filmmaking to tell his story, was quite easy to accomplish during COVID, because it's mostly archival and then animation, as you know, and Lyondecker's artwork. We did have to do some shooting, and I feel like it's become a very well-oiled machine now. I have a shoot tomorrow where I'm very used to the protocol at this point of getting tested and all the rules on set. So we had to do that. This was probably the first film I worked on at the beginning of the pandemic where we really had to get our feet wet on how to shoot in a COVID world. But I feel like the industry pivoted really fast in figuring out how to do it safely. And now it's just become kind of routine. I think it's going to be strange, knock on wood, when we go back to a non-COVID world of shooting, when we don't have to be following all these protocols.
Yeah, it's a good point. Smriti.
I absolutely hated making a film during COVID. It was so, especially an observational verite documentary like Shelter was. We started filming in August of 2020, so it was right in the heart of the pandemic. Before vaccines, before even testing, was sorted out. So it was really difficult, and it, frankly, I'll be completely honest about this. I think it compromised the film. I'm very proud of the film, and I think ultimately we pulled it through. But, especially films like this that are observational verite films, about people, who are not accustomed to being on camera, who are in vulnerable situations. So much of that process is spending time, off camera, or spending a lot of time filming with them, so that they become comfortable and they can really reveal themselves to you, as opposed to sort of containing, aspects of their lives on shoot days around, certain sort of schedules and things like that. We tried really hard. My producer and I really worked hard to maintain contact with the participants in the film between shoots. Tried to talk to them on the phone and on, FaceTime and things like that as much as possible, so they became familiar with us and comfortable with us. But it was really difficult. It was really challenging to maintain that connection, to the participants that normally would have come so organically from just spending a lot of time with them. And then, in post-production, also, it was a challenge. There was a chunk of time that we couldn't film because, LA was going through its second wave, I guess, or, in last December and January. So there was, there were things that we really wanted to film, changes that were happening that we couldn't, because it would have compromised on safety. And then editing as well. Editing, I think we figured out better, than anything else. Just realized, that probably the first 75% of your film can be, you can work with your editor remotely without too much of a sacrifice or compromise. There's a lot you can do, but it's that last 25% that's incredibly frustrating, when you just want to be sitting next to your editor and, moving like 12 frames back and forth and, trying to problem solve that. To do that, remotely is a challenge. But my editor that I worked with on this film, Adam Savatek, he really worked hard to troubleshoot that. So we kind of ultimately landed on a system where we sort of entered a gaming environment. We used like an app that gamers used and we worked in that environment. So I could actually see, him like doing a live edit. It's not perfect. It's frustrating, but we sort of figured it out. And he was incredibly patient with me when we would be like, no, we need to change this by like 1 second. No, 1 second's too much. No, half a second, and he indulged me, in a lot of those fine tuning changes, especially towards the end. But, it's 30% more expensive and 30% longer process on average, I would think. So it was frustrating, but, feel triumphant that we made it through.
Wow. Yeah. Speaking of the editing process, I guess, and I guess this is a little bit about, the actual shooting of the project too, but your films are all kind of in that mid-length area, like between 30-ish to 40-ish minutes. And I'm curious, how do you know when your film is done? How did you determine the length of it? Like, what were those variables? And Matt, we'll start with you.
I just want to add one thing.
Yeah.
We're just talking about is, I probably made it sound easy, but there is, whether you're shooting or you're in post, there's that hard to quantify creative energy of being next to your collaborators, whether it's a cinematographer or your producer or writer or editor, that just, if you're not in the same room, it's really tough and tedious. So we work through it, but it definitely is, it's harder. Sorry, I just was thinking about that still.
No. Did that make you feel more alone in the process, or just distant?
Well, we had a system that was it worked pretty good. I mean, it was essentially like being on Zoom, where I could see and speak to my editor in real time and see, I guess, what you'd call the client monitor with pretty little latency. And so it worked pretty good. But yeah, it's just, yeah, I'm sitting in the same room that I'm eating in, you know, watching TV in, editing in, you know, the same couch every day for months. And it's nice to just be able to be next to the person in the same room, but it was what it was.
I hear you. Yeah. So yeah, Matt, can you talk a little bit about like, how did you know when your film was done? Did you have limitations on time?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of production, you know, my film is following a group of seniors. It's a coming of age story at a high school and following a group of seniors in this semester. So we knew we had the physical narrative arc of that semester, you know, the football season. You know, I didn't know what the end scene was, but we knew that, you know, we had that physical arc as a structure, and then within that we got to play and certainly did. And then in the edit, you know, you can go on forever, but you know, you have a budget and you want to get it out there, and you just got to put it to bed at some point. But I'm really happy with it. Yeah.
Yeah, we like it too. So thank you.
Thanks.
Ryan.
Yeah, I actually had not, this is my first short film since college, at least, when I made a bunch of shorts. So it was like a whole new game for me. You know, I've done features and I've done a few series now, but never the short format. So I was actually making two at once. So I think Coded is 27 minutes. And the other short that I was making, which is coming out next year, was much more verite driven. And I found that one incredibly hard to figure out how to squeeze into 40 minutes. I think it ended up being 39 minutes. So I've been watching shorts like crazy over the last year to watch how my colleagues have been doing it over the years. You know, so I probably watched, I don't know, like 50 shorts this year just to see. I mean, I found it incredibly challenging, so much harder than I had given my colleagues credit for in figuring out how to tell a great story in such a short amount of time. So I had a producer on my very first film when I was a baby, and she would always use this metaphor that I love for when to end a film. She would always equate it to musical chairs, because I could not end my first film at all, and I was driving her crazy. And she would say, like, Ryan, at some point the music just has to stop and you have to find your chair. And so I always think about that like critical moment in every film. I have it on all of them, whatever it is, if it's my subjects or my editor or me. And, you know, for this one, that sort of like musical chairs moment, I was happy when I finally saw this 27-minute cut. And that's when we called it a day.
I love that. I love the musical chairs. That's good. Smriti.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like figuring out the structure and the length, you know, of the film, we had, I mean, obviously it was commissioned as a short film, so we knew it had to be sort of in that 20 to 40 minute range, probably 30 to 40 minute range. I think mine ended up being about 31 or 32 minutes. These things are so hard to structure. There's just no right answer. I mean, this was a unique challenge for me because it was 3 storylines that all frankly could have had their own feature documentary that we had to weave into, you know, one 30-ish minute film. And so without, you know, hopefully without making it feel too much like a community portrait, you know, type of a thing, or an issue film, you know, we want to have people have an emotional sort of connection, you know, to the characters. So we tried different things, and ultimately, you know, I realized like the real components, you know, the sort of building blocks, you know, are like, you need some kind of introduction, you know, to the characters so people connect with them right away. Some stuff about them just like living their lives, you know, so people really understand them. Something that represents like a low moment, you know, so the audience will understand what they're struggling against. And then something that feels like a resolution, something that feels like, you know, okay, we've gotten through something and we're somewhere. But the trick is to not make that resolution really feel too pat or too permanent, you know, especially for the subject of my film, you know, where the the journey is so cyclical, you know, and even though that there might be like a small triumph, you know, here and there, it's like you want to, you know, our sort of partners, you know, at Sesame Workshop and HBO Max were like, we want to arc towards hope, but we don't want to be unrealistic, you know, about the reality of what people go through. So, you know, that's always kind of like the fine balance, right? Of trying to find, you know, leave people with, you know, some feeling, you know, make sure your participants have agency, you know, in their lives and represent that, but not leave people feeling, you know, too comfortable with the way things are, because obviously it's, you know, the broader situation is it's chronic and it's, you know, it's extremely messed up. So those are like the building blocks that we really, you know, played with. And then within that, it's just about, my editor and I have like a good sort of system where we'll like sort of talk through an outline and he'll work on the building blocks, you know, like the information and the scenes and where to see those things. And then I'll go through footage and just find the tiniest slivers and moments and anything that speaks to me, whether it's an expression on someone's face or like a line that's like, you know, when the camera is shut off, or, you know, any little thing, because from, you know, anything that reveals something to me about the characters, anything that makes me feel anything, frankly. And then we try to marry those things together. You know, it's like, how do we get the information out? How do we have like a cohesive arc? But how do we seed in, you know, those little moments, those little touches that's going to really make the film feel personal to the participants, and help an audience connect to them as real people as opposed to types. So when is it done? I don't know. I'm still messing around with frames. It's done when somebody pries it out of my hands, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that's I've definitely heard that before. So I guess while we're talking about that, do you know, like when you're coming up with the structure, obviously that means that there are certain things that have to be cut out because they don't fit within the structure. Curious if there are any moments or stories that happened during your filming that you wish you could have included if it had worked. Matt, you want to start?
Yeah, and that sort of goes hand in hand with your last question and what Ryan and Smriti were saying is it was hard to even, mine's 38 minutes. And I thought I was going to make a 20-minute film at first. And then I'm like, my first cut was like 47 minutes. So it was hard. Gosh, we included a lot of what we shot. There might be some moments here and there, but we didn't have a ton of shoot days. And so we really packed it in and included most of what we shot, which is rare for me. I usually have tons of stuff that doesn't make it. I'm trying to think. Yeah, really nothing that I feel like, I missed that. And that's not that exciting for me to say, but it's probably the first time I've actually ever said that.
That's nice.
Yeah, for once. But yeah, it was hard to even get it down to 38 because it was just, you know, breathing room or spending a little bit more time with this character or that character. What I learned from coming from more of the feature doc world is where I can have multiple characters is I had to, you know, have less characters and spend more time with them. And you couldn't go off as much on tangents, you know,
Right.
and you know, go down rabbit holes as much and keep it more focused. But that really worked well for this short format. And yeah, it was a great challenge.
Yeah. Thank you. Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, our film, you know, is about J.C. Lyondecker, but it also has these moments where we sort of fast forward in history to his impact on modern day advertising or different parts of advertising history. There were a couple storylines that we ended up cutting out in the end. One that I really loved, but I just felt like disrupted the flow a little bit because of structure, as we were talking about earlier. So, you know, like we included in the film the Subaru advertising campaign in the 90s geared towards lesbians. And we included a moment recently where a Black trans model named Yari Jones was the face of Calvin Klein. But we ended up cutting out Keith Haring, the artist from the graffiti artist from the 80s who did these amazing ads for Absolute Vodka, which was one of the very few brands willing to advertised to gay people and in gay magazines during the AIDS crisis. And they hired Keith Haring, an HIV positive gay artist, to do the ads. But it was one of those stories that just felt like it stood on its own. Whenever I watched it within the film, it felt like it disrupted the flow and almost was like a short film within a short film. So it's one of those things I just got like on the side now, like this 6-minute little piece about Keith Haring and the AIDS crisis, which I really love. And my editor did a brilliant job cutting, but ended up on the cutting room floor.
Wow, you'll have to submit that too then.
Yeah. That will be a short film. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. All right, thank you, Smriti.
Man, it's every single film I make. There's like a scene in the first cut where I'm like, of course the scene has to be in there. It's like the most important scene in the film. And it's inevitably the scene that ends up getting cut. You know, it's every film I've made. I was like, there's just a scene like that. And in Shelter, yeah, there was a few things that we ended up cutting, you know, because either they would necessitate more, you know, to really give, you know, a particular moment the right context, or it was, you know, we were trying to keep the focus of this film more on the children, you know, or it was like too much into the parent storyline and not, you know, enough about the children. I mean, the most heartbreaking thing was, you know, Victoria and Metzli, the two young girls who are in the occupied house with their mother. They broadcast a radio show from that house. You know, they do a radio show once a week in that house, and it's like amazing and so adorable, and speaks so much to their, you know, their sense of activism and, you know, all of that. But we just couldn't find a place for it. It was great character stuff, but didn't have enough story stuff to fit in, especially when we're weaving 3 stories together. You know, we just couldn't find a place for it. And, you know, maybe if I was a better filmmaker, I could have, but it was tough to let that one go.
No, I hear that. Yeah. Their story is like so fascinating too, that you definitely, you know, well, I mean, I guess that's the sign of a good film, right? Is you want more still. So with all your films, I definitely wanted more. Not because it wasn't finished, but because I was fascinated. So thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, our time is up, and hopefully next year we can meet in person. And I just wanted to thank you all for being with us today. And to our audience, please tell your friends to watch the shorts in Shorts Program 6 and all of our other shorts at AFIDOCS. They're available to screen throughout the festival, and we would love to hear from you on our social media. So hashtag AFIDocs. Also, join us for more great films, virtual events, and ways to interact with our filmmakers at docs.afi.com. So thank you all so much. Thanks for being here. All right, bye.